Good afternoon and welcome to this special webinar on Andrew Tate. My name is Julian Turner. I'm one of the directors at the day, and I'd like to welcome you all. There are some people here who are the day members. It's great to see you again, and there are also some new people here as well. So welcome to you. And the day is the website that turns the news into lessons and helps schools and young people manage conversations around difficult issues such as the one we're going to be talking about today. So before I introduce our panel, just a couple of little housekeeping points. So the first thing is that this webinar will be recorded. So that means that you'll be able to watch it on playback and it'll be shared online as well. And by being in the webinar, you're consenting to that. There will be a Q&A opportunity at the end of the session. So please, if you look at in your screens, you'll see the chat. We're using the chat today for your questions. Put questions in there, and the chat, I'm delighted to say, it's going to be moderated by my colleague Coralie of the day. So she will be happy to answer any other questions that you've got. With that, let's move on, and I'll introduce the panelists. So today, I'm really pleased that we have Dr. Sue Roffey, who is an educationalist and an expert on education around relationships, in particular in schools. And we also have James Pledger, who is from the Grove School. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
And the topic today is about Andrew Tate, which I think has been one of the most difficult issues that schools have had to deal with and discuss in recent times. We've had a lot of feedback on that here at the day, and in particular, what it is that teenage boys find so attractive about Andrew Tate, and why is it so important that teachers and schools address issues around masculinity, what it is to be a man, and in particular this kind of toxic brand of masculinity that Tate represents. And it's important to enable those conversations to take place in a safe and structured environment. So how we're going to operate this is that Sue is going to say some things to begin with about how we might tackle some of these issues, and then James is going to talk about his experience of doing so in his own school and how he has used the day to do that. So Sue, you've described, and we've spoken in the past about your concept of growing good men. So tell us a little bit about that and about how Andrew Tate fit in with this whole idea of male identity among adolescents.
Thanks very much, Julian. I think it's probably worth saying at the outset, because I think that many people in the audience today will see themselves as good men. Men are not actually the problem. There are plenty of good men around, and I think that by and large that's better than it was. I am surrounded by good men, my husband, my brothers, my son, his friends, etc. The problem is toxic masculinity, and although it's a comparatively small group, it's an increasing group, and there's a vulnerable group, a group that are vulnerable to the influence of Andrew Tate, and that group can cause immense damage to women in our society, both now and in the future. I think it's really important that we hold on to that. I'm going to address 4 issues in this next 10 or so minutes. One is about identity and identity in the teenage years, and the role models that are presented to our young people, including that of Andrew Tate, the mixed messages that boys receive about what it means to be a man, and issues around power and agency. I'll start off with issues of identity. Now, the teenage years are, as we know, the time of a young person's life where they experiment with who they're going to be. They try on different identities, different personas to see whether or not they fit. They try on different ways of being. And of course, that includes how they're going to fulfill their roles of being a man. And several things will have already happened that impact on that identity formation. The most important one, of course, is the interactions that they have already had with the people in their lives. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And of course, society gives a lot of messages about what it means to be male or female. And I used to think when my son and daughter were growing up that I would no longer be seeing issues around pink for girls and blue for boys, and sections of shops which had boys' toys and girls' toys, but it still happens. I went into a very well-known shop recently, which shall remain nameless, and asked to buy a painting smock for a 2-year-old. And the first question I was asked was, is it for a little girl or is it for a little boy? And I was absolutely astonished by that people are still trying to divide people up at a very, very young age. And that, of course, has influence. Then we also have the constant availability and the draw of social media, much of which was used for very positive reasons to keep people connected. And it was especially used in lockdown when meeting in person wasn't allowed. But the more people are on social media and the more teenagers are on social media, the more influence aspects of social media is likely to have on their identity. And I'm going to go back now to the interactions that young people have with men in their lives. And I think it's worth pointing out that by the time they are 16 years old, many, many boys do not have a consistent, positive, familial role model for how to be a man. There are nearly 3 million single parent families in the UK, and most of those are led by women. So they have a dearth of people to be looking towards. And in March 2021 to March 2022, there are also 1.5 million reports to the police for family violence. The vast majority of these perpetrated by men, and that was an increase on 7.7% on the previous year. And of course, that reality for some of our growing teenagers is going to be very powerful. They will see in their lives what men do. We also know that most teenagers watch porn. They do it from quite a young age, and much of the porn that they watch perpetrates male dominance. There is, for a certain section of the population, a dearth of positive role models for boys in their immediate vicinity, in their immediate communities, except perhaps for the men they meet in schools, which is really an important aspect of presenting them with an alternative male model. So Andrew Tate is in fact jumping on a bandwagon ready to roll. Boys are presented generally with mixed messages, and Andrew Tate is presenting one of those messages. The message is that men are tough, stoical, they don't show emotion, they're powerful, confident, in charge, they demand and get what they want, whether that's respect, girls, fast cars, adventure, and the view of a real man is that they are winners. One of the problems with that message, of course, is that they're not winners because their mental health is at risk. men who are more macho are more at risk of mental health problems. And of course, real men, in inverted commas, real men, gather together to talk about anything but feelings, relationships, and the issues in their lives that really matter to them. They stay away from anything that might be considered in any way soft. But in fact, it is incredibly important that they learn to. And then we have the other image, the other message about what's a good man. And a good man is a caring provider and protector who take responsibilities for their families. And we all know many men who fit that image. But we do have an issue, and a growing issue in our society, where boys and men may struggle to feel worthy in those traditional ways, because for a number of men, their work is not respected. We started to really respect key workers in the pandemic, but very often they're not paid well, and many of the people who become key workers didn't necessarily get academic brilliance at school, and so because of our education system, they were not seen as winners in our society. They may struggle to pay the bills, and that's an increasing issue. And if you look at the number of families who are actually relying on food banks, and in many places, and you can see it now with the increased demand for people to return to the office, despite the fact that many men and women find that they're more productive when they're working at least some of the time at home. They're being asked to return to work, and family responsibilities in many organizations are not acknowledged as something that's as important to a man who's a father as a woman who's a mother. And I think that they sometimes think that things are out of their control, perhaps including their relationships. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about one of the things that I know that Andrew Tate brings up a number of times when he talks about men taking control, is that a basic tenet of well-being, it's writ large in the research, is self-determination. It's being able to make your own decisions about what concerns you and having some control over your own life. Really important aspect of well-being. But we have in many ways taken away that self-determination from young people. I mean, in our education system, we often tell them what to do and how to be, and give them little control in their environment. So it isn't surprising that when they can take control, they do take it, because they see it as something important to do. And one of the Andrew Tate messages is that women are taking control and power away from men. And we all know that that isn't true, but it's a powerful meme and part of his influence. Many boys are not learning what is involved in a healthy relationship. And that's not just in those disadvantaged, more impoverished areas of our communities. It's also in some of our elite establishments, and we've seen some of that in places like the COVID inquiry. Misogyny is raising its ugly head, and women are being cut out. And when men are not involved in learning what's in a healthy relationship, that impacts on both misogyny and harm to women and girls, and it contributes, as I've already said, to poor male mental health. And that brings us about how important it is that schools address this, both in the curriculum and in the school environment. And I think I'm handing over now to James.
Yes, thank you, Sue. Thank you very much indeed. That's really lots to think about there. And in particular, I think what you say about the importance of male role models in school, and actually the same is true of female role models as well. But that is really interesting. So let's go into school now and talk to James. So James, give us a little bit of context on the Grove, and then tell us how you're handling this.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The Grove is a state comprehensive in Shropshire. It is predominantly white British. We have a very small cohort of children that wouldn't fall into that category, but it is quite a diverse range of socioeconomic backgrounds. Is it appropriate, Julian, for me just to dive in and explain how we responded to?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we first became aware of the conversations around Andrew Tate, much like other schools, I imagine. We were a little bit out of the loop as adults and teachers. We first became aware when children started making the hand gesture that became synonymous with, and that was supposed to be this non-verbal cue for support. And we saw students doing this. And the reason why something like the day proved helpful was because education generally it can be a bit of a slow moving, slow evolving profession in terms of what we deliver. I'm an English specialist. I am still teaching Romeo and Juliet and Macbeth and so on. I'm very happy about it. But those things have been taught in schools for a long time. So when we are presented with something new that we are not necessarily prepared for, it can be a bit alarming. And it certainly was for us initially as staff. We'd got some staff who were quite tech savvy and very active on social media, and they were able to inform us pretty quickly what was going on. Now, by the end of the week, because there were resources available from the day, and I have to say, I'm not a brand ambassador or anything like that for the day. I'm just someone who has used it, and that's why I'm here. We had something that was structured. That was the great thing about that resource and what was provided for us. We had something that was structured. So the initial guidance we were given, or that we found from the PSHE Association, was to not directly mention Tate necessarily by name, to not give him that platform to draw attention to it. So we started off with general messages to parents and general messages to students, and we gave some early guidance for staff around how we were going to approach the issue, and that we got stuff that was there that we could use. What then happened was we were able to use the resources from the day to have targeted conversations with students that had been highlighted to us through, we use the program CPOMs, other schools will have their own MIS and other ways of recording behavioural and social concerns. So any students that had been flagged up through that process or through the head of year process, we were then able to have actual group discussions with those students. And we used the resources and other resources that we had to start a conversation specifically around the terminology initially. What do we mean by misogyny? What do we mean if we say that something is toxic? And we had to make sure that we were using a common language and that we all agreed what that language was, because it's very easy for children to take ownership of that. And much like Sue was referring to, this is a group of young people who are searching for an identity and sometimes looking for answers. And it's important, I think, that as teachers, we are trusted to provide those answers. Yes, there are very loud voices out there, such as Tate, who can provide answers. But the thing that really mattered to me was that we were able to give staff a structure to have those conversations in a purposeful but safe way. We knew that stuff had been researched properly in the background. We knew that it was legitimate, that it was going to be quality, that it was going to be balanced, all these things that have drawn me and my school towards the day. We knew that we would have a structure there to then facilitate further conversation from it. And once we'd had the conversations around the language that was being used, that then led into some really meaningful conversations, not just for students, for staff. I had a lovely conversation to start this week ahead of this conversation about the conversation she'd had with the group of boys that she'd been speaking to around her experiences post-divorce and about what it was like for her to return to work, and whether 30, 40, 50 years ago, her expectations around returning to work could have been the same as a as a mother of three going through divorce, were her options open now, or were we still in a position where there was an element of control and that society was maybe set up against her? And I think that perspective, the different perspectives that came out from the conversation that then could bring staff in a comfortable way, led to more meaningful, purposeful conversations with those students. So that's how we responded to the Tate thing specifically. If it's okay, Julian, I could talk a little more about how that's now spread across the curriculum. Or is that all right?
Yes, do
so
that.
Initially, it was through my English role that I became involved with the day, and I'm the literacy lead for the school. I had great belief in the day straight away, because I see reading and personal development as going hand in hand. And in our reading strategy, it's not just about reading ability and standardized scores and things like that. It's about scrutiny. What sources can be trusted? Why do certain people have certain perspectives? And what they may be seeking to gain from people by presenting that perspective in certain ways. And there's a real overlap with personal development there. So we have 3 dedicated reading sessions a week around using the day resources. Freedom's given to staff for that. They generally pick the ones that have popped up that day or the day beforehand that they're interested in, or they think students will be interested in. The reason why we chose the 3 days, we still wanted to have the fictional reading for pleasure. That tends to be at the heart of most reading strategies. But the biggest feedback or endorsement for it when I first trialed it with a group of students was they said they preferred the day to reading. They said that this is better than we're doing reading. So they didn't actually perceive the articles and the conversations that went with it as reading per se.
Reading, exactly.
And which is ironic when that's exactly what it's doing and what we're seeking to do. So we found that the engagement came from that, and then the discussions came from that. And we left the 3rd day open if anything had come up in the discussions of the articles that students wanted to continue with on the 3rd day. And indeed, they frequently do. We've moved from that model now because of what I said about how it overlaps with that personal development side of things. That's now part of our personal development curriculum. We have, as well as the daily discovery sessions is how we term it, we have a fortnightly dedicated session on a Wednesday afternoon where those are linked specifically to areas that we know matter to our students and where we have seen resources on the day either very recently or we know are in the archives. So the personal development curriculum is, in the truest sense, a very live, reactive, responsive curriculum, to the point where today, the last meeting I had before I came to this one, was around the resources we were using to facilitate discussions around bullying, and what with anti-bullying week coming up, those resources are going to be used as part of that. But we cover a range of things in those discovery sessions, and that half term is mapped out using those resources, and we know that we get good quality conversations from students. They don't need to be writing loads. It's more about the quality of the conversation that comes out from it.
I think that's really important. I mean, one of the things I was going to say, I don't know if this rings a bell with you, Sue, as well, is that when a big thing happens, and actually later in the webinar I'm going to show some of the resources that we have about Gaza. When a big incident happens in the world that is really difficult, really challenging to talk about, you can't instantly create a culture that didn't exist before in terms of how one talks about these things. So I think it's very, very important that you develop in schools a structured, safe environment for talking about all sorts of issues, so that people know they're able to do so in a managed way where they can develop their opinion and be respected for it. And I think that it particularly when you've got mixed gender classrooms as well.
I think it's important to, I'm very glad that you talked around conversations, James. That was really valuable, because my position is that conversations create culture. And one of the things that's happened with Andrew Tate is that there's been this online conversation that people have been sharing and sharing. And unless our young people have other opportunities to have different sorts of conversations, then that culture will dominate. We need to actually be thinking very carefully about giving young people opportunities to have alternative conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get a poll up now, if we could, for everybody on the webinar. I'm really interested in the extent to which people have had discussions about misogyny or Andrew Tate specifically in either mixed gender groups, or in all girls groups, or in all boys groups. And do I think I'm right in saying that you can vote for more than one if you've done more than these, and then just tick all that you've done. So have if you don't mind, the poll should be up on your screen now. Please do vote. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to do a reminder. Thank you, Sharon, for your question. We're going to come back to that in a minute. I'm going to ask James about how you fit these discussions into the school day. I wanted to, so please do get your questions in the chat. And I was also going to mention that many people on the webinar came here because we did a special report on Andrew Tate with a collection of articles and some overarching questions. But if you have not received that report, then we will be sending that out again in an email to all of the participants. And we'll show you in a little while how to use a special report from the day. But I think you might find it interesting. So, Chloe, do we have an answer on the polls? So that is interesting. So a lot of people are having these discussions in mixed groups, which I think is a really interesting question, actually, because I think it is very important to have it in mixed groups. But I also wonder whether you need to have it in boys only groups as well, or in girls only group. What's your view, Sue?
I think that there is a place for both of them, to be honest. But I think that they have different purposes. I think that if you're going to be talking about male identity, then I think it's really useful to have all boys together with a male facilitator. I think that really enables boys to have more freedom in the conversation. But I also think that mixed groups are really important. So you mix up not just groups, because I think that if you're not careful, boys stick together, girls stick together. You mix everybody up so that people are across gender. You play games to do that, and then you talk with each other about overarching issues like, what do you hope for your future and things like that. And I think when you do that sort of thing, you do a couple of things. You get people to talk about things that are that they find commonalities, that you break down stereotypes, you break down prejudice. Boys start to see girls maybe in a different sort of way, with greater humanity. But I also think that if you're going to be talking about male identity, I think it's very difficult to do that in a mixed group. I think it is probably more freeing to do it in a boys only group.
Yeah, there's a lot of vulnerability there. There's a lot of vulnerability there potentially. I think that it's important for boys to be able to express and discuss.
I mean, one of the activities that I've published in one of my books around sort of growing great men is actually getting boys to talk about not themselves, because that's, as you said, Julian, too potentially alarming, threatening for them. But what does it mean to be a real man? And where do those images come from? Where have you learned this? And what does it mean to be a good man? And what are those images and where have you learned it?
Yeah.
So I think that those sort of overarching impersonal issue-based conversations are very useful, because people will think about what's happening for them, but they're not being asked to talk about what's happening for them.
Yeah. James, what did you find? Did you get different responses depending on the gender composition of the conversations that were taking place?
Well, in both, so we've done both actually, not just on this matter, but in other matters as well. We've had a girls and boys only groups and then mixed groups. I think and generally good responses. The points that you picked out about the vulnerability that goes with that can be a challenge for people to open up. But my personal experience when I was running some of those sessions was that the different perspectives from the different side, if you could actually structure that conversation and facilitate it in a way where it was purposeful and open and trusting, the different perspectives from the boys and the girls actually seem to lead into greater discussions than people not understanding that certain things could be perceived a certain way. And we found that when we've had other discussions as well, particularly around viewing explicit material online or sending it to other people, and women and men in the workplace as well. We've found similar things with that as well. Again, different areas where we've had boys and girls only groups and mixed it as well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to, I think it'd be useful just to, particularly for people who have not used the day, just to show a little bit of material so that you can see what we're talking about here. So this is a special report we did on the Gaza conflict, and as you'll see, there's some introductory ideas and then a number of different stories that are brought together. Now, some of these are informational. So this one here, the human cost of the Gaza crisis, that is actually a poster. And if I can get rid of that, I'll show you. This here is an information poster which brings out some of the facts in a way of trying to get beyond the rhetoric and into some information. And then another story is actually was looking at misinformation in the Gaza conflict. So we had here about false claims, and there was another poster on fake news as well. And finally, there's a more general piece, which I think is quite interesting, which is how you talk about war in general. So, war is such a difficult thing to talk about to young people who've not experienced it. And this is a news story. And I wanted to use this one to show you the sort of the basic process that we use with the day, which is these 6 steps of discovery here, where the first ones are really about how going inside yourself and thinking, what do you already know? How are you connected to this story? What do you already think about it internally? What are the questions that you ask? And then the second stage is then making connections between you and going out, investigating, researching, finding some information, reading the story, reading the facts in the story. There may be some new vocabulary there as well. And then the fourth thing is about building your own point of view, constructing a point of view that you feel confident about, so that you can then express that. And that confidence in expression, combined with the respect of listening to other people, I think is part of that environment which you need to create generally and consistently in order to be able to have difficult conversations. And then the reflection is the last stage. So that's how every story on the day works, basically. And there's some quotes, there's research, there are various other things, supporting material around it. But this is sort of this last couple of weeks have been very obviously very, very important. And we would typically also have, with a special report, a worksheet like this, so that to help people think about the difference between facts and opinions, what they think, what other people are saying, and to develop these critical thinking skills, critical literacy skills, thinking about who the participants are in the story. So that's the sort of thing that we do. And as I said earlier, if you haven't already seen the Andrew Tate report, which is structured in a very similar way, then that will be sent round to you after this webinar. So thank you for that. We have got some questions. So just one quickly leading on directly from that, James, that question we had earlier. But so how do you fit these discussions into the school day? What kind of time of day do you tend to use?
Yeah, we've got, so the Daily Discovery Programme is the morning typical registration programme, but our dedicated reading time is the afternoon registration slot, dedicated 20 minutes. Now, I'm sure everybody here will appreciate that as soon as you get into a discussion like this, 20 minutes is not going to cut it. So there's the opportunity to continue the discussion the following day, but we also have that discovery session once a fortnight. That's a timetabled hour, period 5 on a Wednesday, where these contentious discussions and debates take place.
Great, thank you. Really interesting question from Jacob. Wants you to enlarge on your point, Sue, about men adopting a more macho persona, having more mental health problems. So he's asking, what do you have any data on that, or where can we find data on it? Where can we read more about it? Because that might be a very useful thing to be able to talk to staff and parents about.
I mean, I've been citing this a lot, really, from a longitudinal study on resilience that identified young people at risk of mental health issues. About 700 of them, and they followed them up until they were 40. It's a study that is worth talking about, because it's just such a long one. And one of the things in that is that macho men were more at risk, and I think that that's been followed up by a lot of what we see around us in terms of some of the mental health things that have been going around, with people like footballers talking about their mental health and saying that some of the things that need to happen is that men do talk about feelings, that they do begin to understand what's involved in a healthy relationship and how to do that, that more than anything else, they don't think that it's something that they shouldn't be going to a counsellor about or talking to their friends about, but they should actually sort of man up and keep it all under wraps. And I think that the issue about the dangers for macho men are multiple, and a lot of it is to do with actually not understanding themselves as emotional, relational beings.
Yeah, there's also linked to that. There was a piece of research that Martin Seligman did around the US Army, which is really interesting, sort of talking about building resilience there and what the qualities were that were needed for resilience. And it obviously wasn't what they were thinking. It wasn't how they had been structuring things. It was much more actually about the ability to be able to communicate about feeling and to be emotionally intelligent.
And one thing you might like to look at, and I've just completed the safety chapter for the secondary book on Aspire, and I came across a guy called Tony Porter, and he did a TED talk in 2010, and it's called A Call to Men, and it's quite a long time ago now, but he's carried on with with websites and with talks, and he talks about a man box and how men sort of climb in this box and find it very difficult to get out of it. So I think it's actually worth watching. Ted Porter TED talk, A Call to Men.
Thank you very much. It would be really helpful, Sue, if you don't mind, if we prompt you when we do our follow-up email.
Yes.
We'll put in a link to that, if you don't mind. Maybe you
No,
can mention that
absolutely.
to
No.
one of my colleagues afterwards. So another question here about from Daniel about how difficult it feels sometimes when you are a school and you've created a school environment over which you have some degree of control and you can manage, but you're existing in this sea of social media, and it feels a little bit overwhelming sometimes. Just the power of that social media context. And so is there anything that one can do, against that? Is there any point to this that I feel is underlying that question?
Sorry.
James,
well, my initial reaction to that is yes, of course there is a point, and I can understand why it can feel overwhelming. It certainly does for us at times as well. The thing is, young people, particularly young boys, they in this instance, they already have their own networks, don't they? They're already talking about this stuff, and whether that's online or whether it's conversation they continue when they're at school or when they're socializing outside of school as well. And what's important to us is to become part of that network. You will have conversations open up to you, we are finding, which sometimes they're testing the water. Sometimes they're just throwing a phrase out within earshot to see what happens. For example, recently the Mason Greenwood case came back, and it was two lads were talking to two other guys about it and deliberately said something somewhat incendiary about some of the evidence from that, or some of the information around that case within earshot, to see how staff would react. And I think making sure that you are doing everything to build a culture where you are part of that conversational network still, where you are one of the voices they will still want to hear from, is a way of doing it. Another way of making it count and really making it hit home is that you're not necessarily we're not telling them what to think, are we? We are teaching them how to speak about it, and we are presenting them with information. So our communication strategy here, we don't really have a literacy policy. We have what's called a confident communicator strategy in 3 strands, which it goes speaking, reading, writing, in that order of priority. Conversation is the number one thing for us, so that the skills of speaking around it, not just these matters, but issues in lessons as well. It's just a conversation that we hold sacrosanct. That is the thing that is most important, and making sure that we are part of that network of conversations that's going on. So not just leaving it as something else, conversations that they're having online or in their own groups, but instead bringing it into classrooms, bringing it in with trusted adults, presenting them with material, not saying this is what you should think, but this is how we talk about it, and here is some information. So now what do you think? And now we've presented that, what do you think? And that, from that, we have had some success.
Yeah, that's great. Sue, we were talking about mixed gender groups and different approaches to boys and girls, and you were talking about identity. Obviously, it is one of the very obvious and important changes that have taken place over the last decade or so around gender identity more generally, and the fact that there are so many different and evolving and mutating attitudes to gender identity. So I think that must make this conversation also more challenging, because those groups also, as one of our watchers points out, are also going to be likely to be the victims of toxic masculinity as well. People who are exploring different aspects of their gender identity.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, this is about letting people explore freely who they want to be, helping them look at the influences. And somebody's actually written on the chat around, having talking about a good man. When do you start doing that? Is year 8 or an 8-year-old sort of. And my view is that you start looking at gender identity from the very earliest years of a child's life. It really, really matters. And I'm speaking from experience. I've got a granddaughter and 2 grandsons, and it's the books that are read to them. It's checking in whether or not you're using he, she, or they. It's about giving. If you talk about Superman, for instance, you actually also say, washing Superman's outfit. Who washes Superman's outfit? Maybe Superman does that. It's talking about girls being able to do a whole range of other things and getting images of male and female role models around the school walls, so that people are already immersed in different ways of being male and female. That's actually right from the early years onwards. Starting, identity, of course, is really, really important. But as I've already said, it's the interactions that people have all their lives that are actually going to influence what they think is the way to be.
Yeah. Do you think there is a skills issue here to some extent? When you look at the role models for women in talking to each other, in banding together, in being supportive, in being supportive in positive ways, in the role models for women doing that are more current and more sort of energetic than the role models for men doing that young men see. That it's I wonder whether there is actually a particular issue here around supporting boys and enabling boys to talk to each other and network with each other in a way where they can be authentically themselves and talk about the things that genuinely worry them, rather than the things they think they're supposed to be talking about.
Absolutely right. And those opportunities in schools around social emotional learning right from a very early age. What do you think, James?
Yeah, I agree. I think the temptation when we seek to engage young people, young boys specifically, is to meet them at their level, and to almost, you never want to be a mate or anything like that, but the temptation is to adopt a somewhat kind of chummy attitude and maybe reflect some of the relationship they have with their friends, where really the opportunity there for us as adults is to encourage discussions about what it is that they choose to define themselves. What do they choose to be the defining thing about themselves? Does it have to be around what it is to be a man per se, and what it is that has value with their friends? Why do those things matter to them? Or are there things that are more important to them? That's where, particularly with my subject, we're privileged, because in English, the things that we cover, not just in English, but in other subjects as well, but particularly I find in English, some of the themes that we cover through the text are universal themes. Yeah. So it can be quite a challenge, I think.
There's a Dutch auction going on the chat about how young one needs to start having these conversations with. So it's sort of so our resources, I don't know whether we have produced any resources of the day for primary on this topic, but I am motivated by the conversation that's going on in the chat to make sure that we do. So I'm going to take that away. It's clearly something we need to go into earlier than Key Stage 3 about, because it's
yes, absolutely.
I would say
actually, that. Sorry, James, go on.
It's just on a personal perspective. After 20 years or so of being in schools and working, I've gone a lot through that thing about, as an English teacher, you're going to have this class because these boys need a positive role model, and seemingly as a man, I'm better placed to do that. I'm not sure how much I subscribe to that, though I understand the point. I've recently become a dad, and I've got an 18-month-old boy, and I am already thinking about these things.
Absolutely.
That's not me being an evangelist. That's just what I feel is imperative based on what I've learned and experienced working with boys, that I didn't feel on a personal note I could start too soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for saying that, James.
Yeah, no, quite likewise. Well, I think I've said this to Sue previously, but sort of for me, there is a kind of a process of re-engineering that many boys have to go through, and sort of unpicking certain things. So that might be a topic for a future webinar. There's some great recommendations in the chat, which we are going to capture and include in the email that goes out. So yeah, I love that book as well that Molly mentioned. Is that right? Yes, the Stories for Boys Who Dare to Be Different. I see my colleague Coralie was also a fan, so we shall definitely include that. Are there any other, when you're thinking about positive role models, are there people that you use to, when you're in schools talking to young people, positive male role models that you like to juxtapose against people like Tate, or do you think it's about making your own?
I mean, I think that there's different, there's the immediate role models around, but I also think we need to be thinking about who's in the public eye. And one of the people that I am a huge fan of is Marcus Rashford. I mean, you know, that he has, you know, used his notoriety that he's gained through football to actually talk about some really important issues that matter, and has taken action on them. So there's him, and I'm sure that I can't think of somebody off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are many other men in the public eye, and that also have that we can point to. I mean, clearly, you know, probably no longer current, but people like Nelson Mandela and what he actually promoted in terms of emotional literacy is beyond anything that I can see in our current political arena at all.
Yeah.
Well, it's about being, you know, being connected with yourself and connected with other people, and knowing what that means with a bigger picture, you know.
Someone on the chat mentioned Stephen Bartlett as well, who's an entrepreneur, who's another, you know, interesting figure and attractive figure as well. James, what were you going to add? Oh,
I didn't know he had a red card. Somebody should have said
that. Look, listen, that's very important, though. It's very important. You know, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes.
Yeah, Roman camp.
How you react to it, you know.
Yeah.
It's someone I was going to say. Someone's actually alluded to it on the chat. I think maybe Mike. I didn't quite catch it. It came but left. Mentioned about how you look at some of their own role models, and then you look at the virtues of those people, and that opens a discussion. And I think those big profiles, those people, sometimes we often have PR around them. They're good starting points, but the world isn't black and white, is it? It's always shades of grey, and there are multiple different things that we can pull in from different public figures to start or enrich a conversation. But most importantly, for us, it is empowering the staff. And you've already used, Julian, the term about authentic self, a phrase that I know has got a lot of traction at the moment. We want staff, when appropriate, to bring that as well, because they're the ones who can discuss the subtleties, the nuances of what it is to make a difficult decision and why we make decisions in those ways. So going back to the initial point, I think their own role models are a good way in, but that's a way to then open up a wider discussion about how we can model ourselves what it is that we think young people need to hear about.
And is there also conversations going on in the school in terms of the language that everybody uses? It sounds like your school's a great place and people are aware, but I do know that in a number of schools you might get somebody in PE talking about somebody playing like a girl, or man up, or phrases like that are incredibly problematic, and people need to be aware of how they're presenting to teenage boys, well, not just teenage boys, but both genders from a very early age.
Yeah, no, you're right. That language definitely is proactively addressed through training at our school, not just in gender differences, all areas of diversity. It's covered through that. Unless it's relevant to the conversation, why would you be mentioning any kind of element of diversity at all anyway?
Yes.
But removing those almost ingrained phrases or ingrained perceptions. Someone else in the chat mentioned about parental influence, and whoever that person was, I completely agree. That can be a very challenging thing, particularly when they're 11 by the time they get to us at best. And there's a lot of, Julian, you referred to almost like re-engineering or retraining, I think was the phrase you used, to do. Yeah, we do need to be proactive in considering our language choices as well.
Yeah. So just going to finish off with Jacob's question on asking for advice on how we can frame masculinity positively. So that's going a little bit beyond positive role models, so that boys don't feel that they are overly critiqued or attacked by these kinds of discussions, but we're still sort of able to develop a kind of a positive sense of masculinity. So that's sort of something not just around behaviors, I sense, Sue, but what's your feeling about that?
No, I think that's really important. It's and I think I sort of mentioned it at the beginning about the good men, and talking about men as being, sometimes they go in a wrong direction, but their intentions are good. It's like wanting to protect, wanting to care for, wanting to be responsible. I mean, all of those things are traditionally positive masculine. There's nothing wrong with being fit and healthy. There's nothing, it's great to be doing sports and being strong, but it's not just about being strong physically, but it's also looking at masculinity as being strong mentally and emotionally as well. And I think that I think you're right. I think that whoever said that, it is really important that we don't in any way denigrate men. It's important that we uphold the good of the men that are around us and celebrate that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I would also say there is a broader issue around giving young people the vocabulary to describe themselves in a positive way, and this is all people of whatever gender identity. And I would really recommend schools look at, there is an online survey you can do, a positive psychology survey called Virtues in Action, which you can do, and it will give you some descriptors, answer some questions, and give you some words to describe yourself, to just talk about your virtues. And I think that's actually very important. If you don't have that vocabulary, then you tend to latch on to those socially constructed virtues that have been created for men traditionally, which is very unhelpful. So I'd really recommend that. It's called Virtues in Action. We'll put the link to that in the email as well going out. Right, I think we should draw it to a close now, because we've got people going off to parents' evenings and all sorts of other things going on, happening on a wonderful Thursday night. So I wanted to leave with two thoughts. Well, firstly, to thank James and Sue very much indeed for your expertise and giving up your time. We really, really appreciate it. And secondly, I would be in very great trouble if I did not give you the opportunity to see the QR code that we have here, which will come up shortly. Here it is. And if you use this code, you will get extraordinarily a 7-day free trial to the day that you can use to find out more about our resources, and any of our team would be happy to answer any questions that you have about that and guide you through it. But thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. Great chat going on, and it really is wonderful to see this conversation taking place in schools. You know, you're doing such an incredibly important job in preparing our young people for their future life. So thank you, all of you, for what you do. And with that, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, and good night. Thank you very much.
Good night, Julian.